Rome stood at the height of its power, a republic whose very name made enemies tremble. Its legions marched through conquered lands, its senators debated with arrogance inside marble halls, and in the great arenas, blood was spilled for the amusement of the crowd. In those sand-stained amphitheaters, men were forced to fight not as soldiers of honor but as caged beasts, their lives reduced to fleeting entertainment. Rome's pride was not only in its legions but also in the cries of its people demanding blood. Among the thousands who suffered under this cruel spectacle was a man whose name would echo across centuries, Spartacus. He was born in Thrace, a land of rugged mountains and fierce warriors. From youth he had known the clash of steel and the burden of survival. His people were no strangers to war, and his blood carried the fire of freedom. Yet Rome, the devourer of nations, reached into Thrace and tore him away from his homeland. Captured, chained, and sold in the markets like an animal, he was condemned to live the life of a slave. But within him smoldered a fire that no chain could silence. He was sent to the gladiatorial school at Capua, where life was harsher than any battlefield. The men there were stripped of dignity, trained like beasts, their worth measured only by how long they could survive in the arena. From dawn until dusk, the air was filled with the clash of weapons, the groans of the beaten, and the shouts of the trainers. Among the captives were men from every corner of Rome's empire, Gauls, Germans, Africans, each carrying the scars of conquest and captivity. Most accepted their fate with silent despair, but Spartacus carried himself differently. His eyes burned with something the overseers could not extinguish. The first time he entered the arena, he faced another gladiator. The crowd roared with hunger for blood, nobles leaned forward from their seats, and the sun glared down on the sand. Spartacus raised the weapon they had forced into his hand, but in that moment he swore to himself that he would not die as a pawn in Rome's cruel game. He fought not with the resignation of a slave, but with the fury of a man who refused to yield. When his opponent fell, the crowd erupted in cheers, but Spartacus felt no victory. Each drop of blood on the sand was a reminder that he was living another man's will. Over time, his fame grew. The Romans adored his skill, cheered his victories, and bet on his survival. Yet every triumph was a wound in his heart. To them he was entertainment, but to himself he was still a man longing for the freedom stolen from him. He would sit in the dim barracks at night, the chains biting into his wrists, and whisper to himself, "I was not born to die in their games. I was born to be free." Within the school he found brothers in arms. There was Crixus, the Gaul, broad-shouldered and fierce, who relished the thrill of combat. There was Enemos, an African warrior, strong and disciplined, whose silence carried both grief and strength. There were many others, each one bound by the same shackles. Among them all, Spartacus became something more than a companion. He became a voice, a leader, a spark of defiance. One night, when the air was heavy with despair, Spartacus spoke to them in hushed tones. "What if we do not die here? What if we break these chains and turn our swords against Rome itself?" For a moment there was silence, broken by Crixus's bitter laugh. "Rome is the master of the world. What are we but slaves?" But Enemos answered quietly, "We are gladiators, trained to kill, hardened to endure. If Rome has taught us to fight, then let us use that gift against them." The idea took root. It was madness, yet in madness lay their only hope. Spartacus's voice carried conviction. "We do not fight only for ourselves. We fight for every man chained in the fields, every woman sold in the markets, every child born into bondage. We fight because freedom is not given, it is taken." The decision was made. They would rise. In the year 73 BCE, their chance came. Armed with little more than kitchen knives and wooden clubs, 70 gladiators stormed through the gates of Capua's school. They cut down their masters, broke the locks, and fled into the countryside. Rome thought it a minor disturbance, a group of desperate men doomed to scatter. But Rome was wrong. From this spark a fire was born that would sweep across Italy. Their first battle came swiftly. Roman soldiers were dispatched to crush them. Confident, armored, disciplined, they marched to confront the runaway gladiators. But when the two forces clashed, the Romans discovered their mistake. Spartacus and his men fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose, and with the fury of men who had tasted injustice too long. They tore into the soldiers, and when the dust settled, the Romans lay broken. It was a victory that defied all expectation. Word spread like wildfire. Slaves across the land heard of the Thracian who had defied Rome and won. They abandoned their chains, fled from their masters, and joined his banner. The band of 70 became hundreds, then thousands. In the hills and mountains they gathered, forming not a mob but an army. Spartacus stood at their head, no longer just a gladiator but a commander, a symbol, a living cry for freedom. To his people he said, "We do not fight for bloodlust as they forced us to. We fight for our lives, our dignity, and for the day when no man bows in chains." His words lit their hearts on fire. They were no longer slaves. They were soldiers of freedom. And so began the war Rome had never imagined. A war not of kings or foreign nations, but of its own oppressed rising against it. The rebellion of Spartacus had begun, and it would shake the foundations of the greatest republic the world had ever known. The hills of southern Italy echoed with the sound of freedom. What had begun as a band of desperate fugitives had become an army. Farmers abandoned their plows, slaves cast off their chains, shepherds left their flocks, all rushing to join the Thracian who defied Rome. Their campfires dotted the mountainsides like stars fallen to earth, and their songs carried down into the valleys, songs not of despair but of defiance. Spartacus stood among them, not in gilded armor nor upon a throne, but in the dust beside his men. He ate what they ate, bore the same hardships, and fought where the danger was greatest. To his followers, this made him not merely a commander but a brother, a man who carried their hopes in his calloused hands. Each new arrival came with a story of cruelty, a back scarred by the whip, a child torn from its mother, a life spent in chains. Spartacus listened to them all, and each story became another blade in the arsenal of his cause. Rome could not ignore this wildfire. The Senate, accustomed to commanding legions that bent nations to their knees, was shaken. At first, they mocked. A rabble of slaves, they sneered. Gladiators who mistake themselves for soldiers. Yet their laughter withered when reports arrived. Roman forces dispatched to suppress the revolt had been crushed, their banners trampled in the dust. Spartacus led his people not with brute force alone but with cunning. He struck like lightning where Rome least expected, descending from the mountains to ambush convoys, seizing weapons, food, and armor. The soldiers who thought themselves disciplined were outmaneuvered by men fighting for their lives. Each victory swelled their ranks and spread terror through Italy. The senators whispered in marble halls, "If slaves can defeat our legions, what will our allies think? What will the provinces say? Rome's power will crumble. Pride and fear gnawed at them." They poured more troops into the struggle, determined to stamp out this insult to their supremacy. The battles grew fiercer. On the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, Spartacus and his army found themselves trapped by Roman forces. The legions blocked every path, confident they had their prey cornered. But Spartacus refused to bow to fate. Under cover of night, he devised a plan as daring as it was desperate. His men braided ropes and ladders from vines and crept down the sheer cliffs where no Roman expected them. At dawn, they fell upon the enemy's rear with ferocity. The Romans, caught between cliffs and blades, were slaughtered. The victory became legend. After that, slaves flocked to Spartacus in thousands. Men who had been yoked to plows now bore stolen shields. Women who had been servants tended the wounded and carried supplies. Even children cheered as the banners of freedom rose higher. In the valleys of Italy, a new nation seemed to be forming, a nation not of land and laws but of people bound by the dream of liberty. Yet Spartacus's vision was greater still. He longed to lead his people beyond Italy, through the Alps and back to their homelands. There, they could live free, beyond the reach of Rome's chains. He spoke to his closest allies, Crixus, fierce and bold, who thirsted for battle above all, Enemos, wise and steadfast, who counseled patience. "If we march north," Spartacus urged, "we can escape this endless war. Freedom lies beyond the mountains." But not all agreed. Some saw victory after victory and dreamed not of escape but of conquest. "Why flee?" they argued. "Rome trembles before us. Let us strike at the heart, march upon the city itself, and tear down its walls." Their words inflamed many, and a rift began to form within the ranks. Still, Spartacus pressed on. The army divided, some under Crixus choosing to stay and fight in southern Italy, while Spartacus led others northward. The Romans seized the chance. They ambushed Crixus's band, and though he fought with unmatched courage, he and his followers were overwhelmed. When Spartacus heard the news, grief struck him like a blade. He ordered that 300 Roman prisoners be forced to fight to the death in memory of Crixus, not as entertainment but as a grim mockery of the games Rome so loved. It was both tribute and vengeance, a message carved in blood. The dream of freedom burned brighter even as the path grew darker. Rome sent more legions, commanded by consuls, but they too fell before Spartacus's brilliance. Again and again he outwitted them, using the mountains as shields, the valleys as traps, striking where least expected. Entire legions fled in shame, their standards abandoned. In Rome itself, fear spread like plague. Nobles locked their villas, citizens whispered of the slave army that seemed unstoppable. Mothers told their children to hush, or Spartacus would come for them. To the oppressed, his name was hope. To the masters, it was dread. Yet within Spartacus's camp, tension simmered. The Alps lay within reach, the gateway to freedom, but many of his followers refused to leave. They had tasted victory and hungered for more. They wanted Rome itself. Spartacus's heart was torn. He longed to lead his people home, but he could not abandon them to their thirst for vengeance. So the war raged on. More battles, more blood, more victories. But Rome was learning. The Senate, humiliated and desperate, entrusted the task to one of its wealthiest and most ruthless men, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Unlike the others, Crassus underestimated nothing. He knew. This was no mere rabble but an army that had shamed Rome. He would crush them, no matter the cost. Crassus began with discipline as merciless as iron. He restored fear in his own ranks by punishing failure with decimation, forcing his soldiers to kill 1 in 10 of their own comrades. Terrified, the legions obeyed him without question. Then he turned his attention to Spartacus. He would not chase recklessly, as others had. He built fortifications, cut supply lines, and sought to trap the rebels in the south. Walls of men and stone stretched across the land, hemming them in like beasts in a cage. Spartacus saw the noose tightening. His followers still numbered in tens of thousands, but hunger gnawed, supplies dwindled, and morale wavered. Even then, he did not yield. He gathered his men and spoke with fire. Rome believes us broken. They believe we will surrender. But I tell you this, we were slaves once, and we bent our backs under the lash. Never again. If we are to fall, let it be as free men, with swords in our hands and defiance in our hearts. His words rekindled their spirit. They would fight, whatever came. The storm was gathering. The greatest battle lay ahead, a clash that would decide not only the fate of Spartacus and his army but the memory of freedom itself. Rome's might bore down from the north, while from the south new legions approached. The rebels were caught between the jaws of an empire. And yet, even as the shadow of doom closed in, Spartacus stood unshaken. His followers looked to him and saw not a man destined to die but a leader who had already carved his place in history. Whether they lived or perished, they knew their names would not be forgotten, for they had defied the might of Rome. The stage was set. The mountains would run red, the fields would tremble under the clash of steel, and the world would remember that once, slaves rose as warriors and nearly brought Rome to its knees. The winter winds howled across the plains of southern Italy as Spartacus prepared his army for what he knew might be the last campaign. He had led them through fire and blood, across mountains and valleys, and though Rome had bent again and again, the empire had not broken. Now, Marcus Licinius Crassus had tightened his grip. Walls of earth and stone cut across the peninsula, stretching from sea to sea. Rome's trap was closing. The rebels fought to break free, hurling themselves against the fortifications. Time and again, Spartacus led charges, his sword flashing in the winter sun, his voice rising above the chaos. They cut through palisades, filled ditches with the bodies of fallen foes, and for a moment it seemed they might break through. But Rome's numbers were endless, their reinforcements constant. Hunger gnawed at the rebel camp, and despair began to take root. Yet Spartacus would not surrender to despair. He gathered his men, tens of thousands of weary but unbroken souls, and stood before them with eyes like burning coals. Rome thinks us beaten, he thundered. They think we will kneel, that we will beg for chains once more. But look at yourselves. Look at the scars on your backs, the calluses on your hands, the fire in your hearts. We are not slaves. Not anymore. Every drop of blood we spill is a victory, for it tells Rome we will not be owned. If we must die, then let us die as free men, and our story will echo across the ages. The camp roared with fury and pride. Men who had once bowed in silence now raised their voices in defiance, ready to meet death on their own terms. Spartacus sought allies still, hoping to escape the tightening net. He tried to bargain passage with pirates to carry his army across the sea, but the pirates betrayed him, taking his gold and vanishing into the night. Rome had bribed them well. The dream of freedom across the sea vanished with the tide. Betrayal, hunger, exhaustion, all pressed upon him. Yet still he fought. He led raids against Roman outposts, seized supplies, and struck fear into his enemies' hearts. But Crassus was patient, relentless. He tightened the walls, cut off every escape, and forced Spartacus's army into a corner where only one path remained, the path of battle. The final day dawned under a blood-red sky. The fields stretched wide, scattered with the banners of Rome. Crassus commanded legions upon legions, iron walls of disciplined men. Spartacus's army, though fierce, was weary and fewer in number. The odds were impossible, but to Spartacus, there was only one choice. He mounted his horse, lifted his sword, and pointed it toward the enemy lines. Today we carve our names into history. Today we show Rome that freedom cannot be caged. Follow me, brothers, and let the world remember how slaves became warriors. The rebel horde surged forward, a storm of desperation and courage. They clashed with the Roman front lines, shields shattering, spears thrusting, swords ringing like thunder. Spartacus was everywhere, striking at the heart of the enemy, rallying his men when they faltered, driving forward with unrelenting fury. Through the chaos he saw Crassus's command, the eagle standards gleaming above the Roman center. He knew the battle's heart lay there. If he could strike Crassus down, perhaps Rome's resolve would break. With a cry that split the heavens, Spartacus carved his way through the lines, cutting down centurions, scattering soldiers, his blade a whirlwind of vengeance. He came within sight of the Roman general, but fate was cruel. A storm of soldiers barred his path, and though Spartacus fought like 10 men, the tide of steel pressed him back. His horse fell beneath him, pierced by spears, and he rose to his feet, bloodied but unbowed. Surrounded, he fought on, his body a wall of defiance, his sword an unyielding flame. One by one his closest comrades fell, Enemos, struck down while shielding his brothers, Castus and Gannicus, fighting to the last breath beside him. Still Spartacus stood, bleeding from a dozen wounds, but unbroken. The Romans closed in. They offered no quarter. Spartacus raised his voice above the clash, not to beg for mercy but to proclaim his final truth. You may kill a man, but you cannot kill freedom. Rome will never silence us. With those words, he hurled himself once more into the fray, cutting down enemies until his strength was spent. At last, buried beneath a sea of blades, Spartacus fell. But he did not fall as a slave. He fell as a warrior, as a leader, as a symbol that no empire, no matter how mighty, could ever chain the human spirit. The battlefield was a graveyard. Thousands of rebels lay dead, and those captured were crucified along the Appian Way, lining the road to Rome with their broken bodies. It was a warning, a spectacle of terror meant to crush hope. Yet it did not. For though Spartacus's army was destroyed, his name lived on. To the Romans, he was a rebel, a dangerous slave who threatened their empire. To the oppressed, he was a hero, a beacon of what courage could achieve. Even in defeat, Spartacus had scarred Rome's pride, showing the world that the mightiest empire could tremble before men who sought only freedom. Years turned to centuries, and still his story was told. Poets and historians remembered him, slaves whispered his name in the darkness, and warriors across ages drew strength from his defiance. He became more than a man. He became a legend. And though his body fell upon that blood-soaked field, Spartacus's spirit rose unchained, immortal in memory. His sword was broken, his army slain, but his dream endured, carried by every soul who ever yearned to live free.